Hi and welcome to the Corrine Barraclough show. Before I get started, I just want to say that I'm angry and upset. My voice is going to shake, so please bear with me. A couple of weeks ago, you'll remember that I read some quotes from Faith, the mother of Jari Wise, who was murdered in March of this year. Faith is understandably traumatised after losing her son. Her trauma has now been made much worse. Jari was father to his 2 biological children and to the children that his partners had to previous relationships. There was an AVO out on Jari's girlfriend at the time of his murder. He was killed in a hit and run by that girl, who was also over the limit, speeding, and drove off from the scene. Local police have told Faith that they knew something terrible would happen. They'd been called so many times to remove Jari from the property, not because of his violence, but hers. On Monday, August the 31st, Tasmanian police released a statement which read, "A complex investigation into the death of a 26-year-old man at Huonville in February has concluded. A 34-year-old woman from Lucaston will face charges in relation to the fatal pedestrian crash which occurred on 29th of February. The crash resulted in the death of a 26-year-old local man, Jari Wise. The woman will face charges of dangerous driving, driving while exceeding the prescribed alcohol limit, and failing to remain at the scene of the crash. She will appear on these charges in the Hobart Magistrates Court on the 2nd of October 2020. What? Where's the murder or manslaughter charge? And there's no mention of the breaches of the family violence order? So there are no charges to be brought for Jari's death? This is heartbreaking and it's wrong. Jari Wise will not get to see his children grow up, and this woman gets a slap on the wrist. The system is utterly flawed. I would like to use a different F word there, to be quite frank. I and many gutters are absolutely gutted that the so-called justice system has failed, and what makes it even worse is the total lack of media interest in this story. Someone messaged me this week to ask what I thought about the breakthrough of the ABC running one article about male victims of domestic violence. To you and to everyone who has asked for my response to the one lone ABC piece, I'll say this: it's not good enough. It's not good enough to pretend that this is rare. It's not acceptable to churn out a narrative around violence against women when the flaws in the system are absolutely clear to see. I am disgusted. I asked Faith for her reaction and she tells me, "I actually don't have any words, love. I'm sick and numb and angry. I feel like I've lost him again. I've been inundated with kindness, questions and shock from all over the world. No one can believe the injustice, most of all me." From injustice to more heartbreak, I'm afraid. I want to read you a message I've had from an alienated grandmother. The message she sent me was quite long, so I'll read some of it, and I've asked her permission to do so. "Hello, Corrine. I'm one of thousands of grandmothers who suffer the grief of our sons' alienation from their beloved children. My story is similar to many thousands of grandmothers suffering the injustice of the family court system. My son was introduced to this lady by my daughter-in-law. She already had a little boy from a previous relationship. This little boy rarely saw his father. My son attempted to be a surrogate father to him. I live 3 hours drive away and wasn't aware of everything that was going on, although I knew my son was unhappy. My grandson was born in 2011. Things deteriorated, and by the time the grandson was 3 years old, when attempts at getting my son to assault her physically failed, she made false allegations about my son to the police, who promptly arrested him and issued a DVO against him. This was when my husband and I had to spend our own money in order to defend my son with a solicitor. We're on the old age pension. He was given 9 months probation. The solicitor offered to fight this for free, but my son was in such shock he wanted the matter dropped. The woman left the home with the children. My son used to go around to her house, he had a key to let himself in, every day after work for 5 years to look after his son till he went to bed. He put up with her verbal abuse day in, day out in order to see his son. She even used to verbally abuse my grandson, apparently, saying, "You're so like your father." My son taught my grandson his letters and numbers. He was doing very well at a young age, and there was a deep attachment between father and son. He paid all expenses relating to the child, paid for her groceries, paid a $30,000 credit card debt, which had accumulated, fixed her family's cars, fixed their houses, gardens, even did housework for her family members. My son, being a teacher, used to look after his son at his house during school holidays and alternate weekends with the child staying overnight. He never once wet the bed at my son's house, but did frequently at his mother's. My grandson is now 9 years old. My husband and I could only see our grandson during the school holidays at my son's house, as there was always an excuse as to why we could not see him. This all came crashing down when my son recently informed the mother, out of courtesy, that he had met someone else. She went ballistic. She tried to have my son arrested 6 times over a 10-day period on false allegations. It became so bad, my son had to enlist the help of one of his sisters, who's a police inspector, to stop the harassment. She even tried to get him sacked from his job. She ruined my son's relationship with the new woman, hounding her until she believed her lies and left my son. She also refused to let my son see his child, saying that he was too scared to see Daddy. From seeing my grandson daily to being alienated was and is excruciating. My son tried everything to mediate a solution to no avail. I had to pay again for a letter to be sent to her legal aid paid solicitor to inform her solicitor of the truth. He tried mediation 3 times with no success. She even reduced her work hours in order to claim extra maintenance. DOC arranged for supervised visits. One visit happened and the supervisor and staff could clearly see the affection between father and son. They suggested that my son subpoena the records for the court action. His solicitor informed him that costs would be in the vicinity of $30,000 to $80,000, and in his opinion there was little chance she would comply with the orders. Again, I had to pay for legal advice from my pension. My husband and I recently moved closer to the family when I found my son was literally starving, as he's paying huge maintenance and trying to keep his mortgage and bills paid. His friends were feeding him. I am now feeding him on my pension. I have another grandson who cries because he can't see his cousin. How do you explain to a young child the behaviour of alienating adults? This is only a very minute portion of this woman's activities. The viciousness has stunned me. I can't comprehend that someone can get away with all of this behaviour, all sanctioned by the family law courts. I don't sleep at nights with the sadness and the grief of watching my son grieve day after day. I'm presently making attempts to see and be part of my grandson's life. I fully expect her to attempt and succeed in getting an AVO against me. I'm terrified. I also recently found out that my grandson has changed his surname. This upsets me very much. I simply can't write anymore. Regards. This cuts me to my core. Parental alienation is not a men's rights issue. Whole entire families are being obliterated. Aunties, uncles, grandparents, little cousins in tears because they can't see their playmates. This is why the gendered narrative and worldview is so wrong. This is why the feminist portrayal of men as being violent is so evil. Imagine the impact on that poor father's mental health. And of course, gynocentric mainstream media don't want to talk about the real causes. Sunday is Father's Day in Australia, and I wanted to take the opportunity not to talk about glossy, happy families, but to shine a light on male suicide. Here's my interview with David Lionhelm. So my guest today is David Lionhelm, who I really wanted to talk to about a very specific issue. I want to talk to David about male suicide. He wrote a piece for the AFR a few weeks ago, which has really stuck in my mind. And part of that is because nobody seems to want to actually talk about this issue. And the fact is that 6 out of every 8 suicides every single day in Australia are men. The number of men who die by suicide in Australia every year is nearly double the national road toll. So here's David. Let's get him on and start the conversation.
Hello, Corrine.
Hi, David. How are you doing?
Well, thank you.
Good, good. So, look, you and I have had a couple of messages back and forth on the subject of male suicide, and I understand that there's a couple of aspects that you specifically would like to explore. First, I think you wanted to talk about the assumption that suicide has the same causes in men and women. Is that right?
Yes.
What
Yes.
do
I
you
think
mean?
it's a false assumption. I think it's a false assumption. Yes.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, I started to take an interest in this only after I had got involved in the mess that's family law, and when I was in the Senate, and also the domestic violence issue, where the narrative, which you're familiar with, is that it's all male perpetrators and all female victims.
Yes.
And then I actually was Bettina Arndt said it's equally as misandrist, I think, as she might have used that word, or I did, in relation to suicide. Male suicide is many times higher than female suicide, 4 or 5 times as high, and and yet nobody talks about it, and it's not getting any better. So why don't you have a look at it? So the more I dug into it, the more I realised that this is as much a scandal as the family law scandal and the denial of access to children that goes on, and the allegations of domestic violence and pedophilia and all the lies that go on around surrounding that, and also the whole domestic violence issue with massive amounts of money being spent on it and not a word about male victims.
Yes.
And female perpetrators. And it's similar sort of argument. We hear lots and lots about suicide, and it's always referred to as mental illness, which I think is incorrect. But you don't hear anything that sort of fits with the men are from Mars, women are from Venus perspective. It's always assumed that whatever works in women will work in men. Mm-hmm. And yet the statistics don't support that. It's not going down. The rate per 100,000, the number of suicides per 100,000 is actually creeping up, not rapidly, but gradually. So in other words, despite everything that's being done, it's not helping. It's really not helping. You could argue that perhaps it would be worse, but for what is being done. But what we're certainly seeing is no solutions. And I think one of the big reasons is because it's assumed that women and men are the same. They take their own lives for the same reasons. I think that's quite false.
Why do you say that's false? I'm interested to tap into what you mean by that.
Well, the evidence seems to suggest that when women take their own lives, and they do it at much, much lower rates than men, there is some underlying cause that you can find. Depression, substance abuse, mental illness of some description. The link between mental illness and suicide in women seems to be relatively strong in a lot of cases. You can't find that link in men. There is no link. Certainly some men who take their own lives are depressed, but there are plenty who aren't. There's many, many more of them, of course. And you just can't blame it on mental illness. And yet, if you listen to Beyond Blue and Lifeline and the government and all the narrative that goes on, if you're feeling, unwell, mentally unwell, need support, call these numbers. And men don't do that. Men do not do that. And that's nothing. You can't blame that on mental illness. We know what some of the triggers are. There's a lot we don't know about male suicide, but we know what some of the triggers are, and they're nothing to do with mental illness. They're complex psychological factors, but they're not mental illness.
But, David, this is the thing. For years now, I've tried to start this conversation, and obviously you would know, you get howled down and the screeching mob come after you for even daring to try to have a conversation about male suicide. But, I've long been saying we're never actually going to begin to tackle this rising problem until we actually get honest about the contributing factors. And we know what some of the contributing societal factors are. And we know that there's a connection between the flawed family law system and male suicide. But as soon as you're not allowed to say that, are you?
No, I mean, there is an acknowledgement that the family law system is, highly ill-broken, really. When I was in the Senate early on, I had people coming to see me about it, and I realised that if I spent time on this issue, I'd never do anything else. So I did some investigation, had a talk to the people in the Attorney General's Department responsible for family law. They even acknowledged that the system was quite broken. And then I had hopes that the Law Reform Commission inquiry might yield some positive benefits. But as we now know, that turned out to be yet another opportunity to beat up on men. So nothing's come out of it. But and I guess in a way that highlights the fact that we know there's a problem, and there's a general agreement there's a problem, but there's no general agreement about what the problem is.
Yes.
It's a bit like suicide. We know there's a problem, and the government acknowledges there's a problem, and there's a suicide prevention officer appointed by the government now, and they're throwing money at it. But it's all being done on the assumption that what works in women, if anything does, will also work in men. And I pretty much confidently predict it won't make any difference as long as they rely on this assumption that men and women are the same when it comes to the suicide issue. It's a part of this argument that men and women are the same in all walks of life. Men and women should earn the same money, even if they're doing different jobs or choose different career paths. There's no allowance for the fact that women might make different choices from men. There should be the same number of women on company boards as there are men, even though a lot of women don't want to be on company boards. And there's far fewer women candidates for those jobs in any event. And yet, the assumption being all the time, men and women are equal, men and women are the same, there should be equal numbers of women as there are men in so many areas of life. And yet, so it's part of this narrative that men and women are no different. When it comes to suicide, the reasons they take their own lives must be the same. Just ignores the fundamental fact that men are XY chromosomes, women are XX chromosomes. They are different, biologically different. It has a different psychological effect on them, and it is not going to help at all if we keep going down this same path.
And also, don't you think, I think the other more sinister and dark side to this is there is a complete allergy in society to actually talking about female, so women's accountability. And that, I think, is the problem that I see, like as an innocent bystander on the sidelines, the whole discussions around family law. The real sticking point here is female accountability, but we're not allowed to have any of those conversations. And what I mean by that, I guess, is illustrated quite clearly by the opposition to Pauline Hanson having anything to do with the family law inquiry, because she dares to say that some women do the wrong thing. Well, of course they do. Women are human beings, and when they have something to gain or lose within a, say, family law situation, they might not always act ideally. But if we're not willing to even acknowledge that, then how can we even begin to start tapping into the real causes of male suicide? It just doesn't make sense to me. Yes,
that's right. It's part of what you've just described is part of a bigger issue that ultimately ends up in the male patriarchy narrative that men have inherent advantage just because they're men. They're responsible for most of the ills in the world, and women are the victims of those ills. That women are not really responsible for what's happened to them. It's men who are responsible for that. And then when men are, in my estimation, the victims, there's a denial of that. Men can't be victims, especially middle-aged men. You can't have middle-aged men who are the wealthy ones, the controllers, the people in charge, people making decisions. You can't have them being victims. So when they kill themselves in large numbers, far higher numbers than the numbers who kill themselves in road accidents, for example, and quite a lot of road accidents, for that matter, are suicides too, especially when there's a single person in a single vehicle. Then just go. It contradicts the narrative, the argument that it's males are the source of the problems and women are the victims. The reality is that, I mean, I'm no expert at the causes of male suicide. I don't think anybody could claim to be an expert, really. The fact is, the old joke, there's two things that we don't know about male suicide: what causes it and what to do about it. Apart from that, we know everything, but I have some theories, like a lot of people, and I think the notion that men are always responsible for everything that goes wrong is part of the reason they take their own lives. Some men can't cope with that. Some men obviously kill themselves over money issues. Why would a man kill themselves over a money issue and not a woman? And a woman not kill herself over a money issue? Because they hardly ever do over that. Because men and women are different. Men have this provider mentality, which is, different from what women have. There is an expectation that men will be strong and have solutions and fix things and guard their family and all those sorts of things. And men have this expectation about themselves that when they don't meet that standard, whatever that standard is, whether it's reasonable or not, it's something that occurs in their own head. I think in some cases that prompts them to end their own lives. They feel as if they've not lived up to their own expectations. That's not something that occurs with women, not to my knowledge anyway. So, this failure to acknowledge the fact that men and women are distinctly different. It's hardwired, it's biological. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. Seems to me to be something, if we don't address that, if we don't acknowledge that that difference exists, in 10 years' time, the male suicide rate will still be 4 or 5 times the female suicide rate, and the overall rate will still be, much, much higher than it needs to be. And Lifeline, Beyond Blue, all of those ones, they're doing nothing. They're not achieving anything. They're getting money and resources thrown at them. They're achieving nothing, essentially.
But, David, even through the COVID pandemic, we've seen millions and millions of dollars being thrown at these organisations. But where's the accountability? Why does government keep giving these organisations, and it's always the same organisations, there are a handful of green-lighted mental health supposed organisations that are given all of this money and funding, but there is no accountability, and they're not actually shown that they're doing any decent work, and they're definitely not helping drive the numbers down. Why does government just keep throwing money to the same organisations rather than saying this is not working? We need to look at different organisations that maybe are producing different results and can actually prove that they are doing some kind of peer support or some kind of local community work where actually at a grassroots level it's really showing an impact. But they don't seem to they seem to think that it's just the virtue signalling of giving X amount of $1 million means that they're doing enough to tackle mental health. But the numbers are heading in the wrong direction, aren't they?
Yeah, the numbers are definitely heading in the wrong direction. Governments, you have to understand who they are. Having spent 5 years in Parliament, I can tell you there's no repository of wisdom and expertise there. Politicians and public servants don't have any more solutions to anything than everybody else has. They don't have many tools at their disposal that are easy, and money is probably throwing money at something is probably the easiest of them all, and that's why it's done so often. So when somebody says there's a problem, and they will look for a quick fix, what can we do about it? And the answer is often respond to whoever's got their ear. So the public servants will some of them at least will be paying attention to what's going on in the community, and sometimes they will know facts. But I mean, you know, not that I'm suggesting there's anything sinister about it, but Beyond Blue and Lifeline have high-profile public advocates. Who was the chair? Jeff Kennett, I think, was the chair of Beyond Blue for a while. Yeah. Why did Beyond Blue get so much money thrown at it? Because people knew who it was. It said the right things. It's a bit like funding for the arts. You know, the noisy voices attract the funding. Politicians and bureaucrats just want the problem gone. They say, "Oh, we've done something about that. What's next? Let's move on." Yeah. And they have no particular expertise, so they just listen to whatever voice happens to be around at the time. But your point about accountability is very valid, because what they ought to be doing is saying, "Okay, come back in a year and tell me what you've achieved," and setting some KPIs. So, by how much did you reduce suicide? You know, so we've given you money and half a dozen other organisations money. By how much did you reduce suicide? So data on suicides is a bit tricky to obtain, because a lot of people don't like to admit they committed suicide, and insurers won't pay out on it either. So you do have to be a little cautious with the data, but nonetheless, there is data. There is data there, and it ought to be that those who are receiving money supposedly to reduce the rate of suicide don't get any more money if they don't reduce the rate of suicide. Producing coloured brochures and videos and websites and all that sort of stuff should count for nothing unless it produces results. And that's the problem. Results are not there. After I did that article in the Financial Review about male suicide, I was contacted by quite a few people, and one of them was someone who used to work at Lifeline. And his comment was, it's completely misandrous. It's dominated by women, and you know, they're not favourably disposed to men at all. Various other comments of a similar nature. And then when you look at the organisations working on suicide prevention, and that includes Suicide Prevention Australia, about 80–90% of them are women. Now, I'd hesitate to say that because you're a woman you can't understand male suicide. I wouldn't go that far, but I'd argue that because you're a woman, your chances of understanding it are reduced compared to a male. You're just biologically different. So it would seem to me that a good start in dealing with male suicide is to have males involved, at least in trying to understand it. Plenty of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think that, as like the general community, what can we do to try to spark some change in this area? Is it a question of raising our voices so that we become the noisier ones, actually repeating these statistics and you know, really dragging a light onto the issue and refusing to be silenced about it, much as the screeching left come for us?
Yes. Well, yes, I think that would help. You know, voices raised, but it depends what they're saying, of course. I mean, it's about time the emperor had no clothes when it comes to Lifeline and Beyond Blue. You know, there's this assumption, you'll hear it on ABC every night. If you are feeling troubled, here's Lifeline's number, or call this or call that. I say, bullshit, no good. There's no use calling Lifeline. If you're going to top yourself, calling Lifeline won't stop you, especially if you're a male. It might if you're a female. I'm not certain about that. But I think it's time that when we raise our voices, and we should raise them, we say, let's stop giving it to the same old places. Let's stop doing the same things and expecting a different result. That was Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. You don't get one. So throwing more money at Lifeline, throwing more money at Beyond Blue and the other high-profile organisations has been done. It has been tried. If it was going to work, it would have worked by now. Let's do it a different way.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to me, David. We could talk about this all day. Really interesting. we'll catch up again. Did you want to mention your book?
Yes, so one of my other topics that I'm heavily involved with is sporting shooting and the rights of firearm owners. And I've just produced a book, or published a book. It's out by Connor Court, called Gun Control, What Australia Did, What Other Countries Did, and Does Any of It Make Sense? It's got a lot of, it's never been a book like that with statistics about Australian firearms crime, what other countries do, and also even a chapter called Guns Gun 01, which explains the difference between a shotgun and a rifle, and pistols and the various actions, lever action, pump action, semi-automatic, automatic, all that sort of stuff. It's not been done before in Australia, and I think a lot of people, whether they're into shooting or not, would find it handy. And it's published by Connor Court. It's you can buy it directly from them. It's also on Amazon and other places like that.
And people can find you on Twitter and Facebook, is that right?
I'm on Facebook and on Twitter. Yeah, I probably spend more time on Twitter than Facebook. Excuse me. I'm not a fan of Facebook, but yes, I'm there and I do look at my messages.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Corrine.
That was David Lionhelm talking about the incredibly complex and important issue of male suicide. I feel this week's show has been very downbeat and depressing. I'm not going to put any shine on that. This is the reality of the destruction of family law in this country and right around the world. We've got a woman getting away with murder, a grandmother alienated from her beloved grandchildren, a young child crying for the cousin he doesn't see anymore. We've got a soaring male suicide rate. And we've got a mainstream media totally in denial about all of it. Not me. That's why I'm here. And all of this is why I'm doing this show. Thank you all for your support. And while that might be enough Barraclough for now, there will be more next week. Until then, please look out for one another and check in on your mates.
The Corrine Barraclough Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Corrine Barraclough. To watch, listen to or read more new media without the social justice warrior narratives or politically correct fact filter, visit goodsource.news. That's good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.